So I've included Matt Battaglia, our executive producer, because he is perhaps the world expert on comic book geekdom.
Yeah.
And he's also a comic book artist. And we were talking about your book earlier, and we really wanted to dig into the comics chapter because
Sure.
maybe we're jumping ahead a little bit in history, but that is sort of that campaign is standing on the shoulders of the Comstock
Yeah.
censorship structure, right?
Well, it is, and in a weird way, it's sort of like a moral panic in reverse, in that pretty much the day that the comic book panic started for real in 1948 was the same day that the Supreme Court struck down a New York law that was inspired by Comstock to go after dime novels, these cheap novels that sensationalized cowboys and crime and things like that. And this law was passed to prohibit stories of bloodshed and lust, and it was struck down in 1948 in a case called Winters versus New York. And that was really the very beginning of a new campaign against comic books that tried to do the same thing.
Yeah, I drink my coffee usually out of a coffee cup that says Frederick Wortham can eat a dick, but dick is censored. It's a cartoonist kayfabe coffee
So you're
cup.
self-censored.
And so but that's where we've gotten to. But I think that that's interesting that it got struck down. But if you could, so Wortham wrote his book, Seduction of the Innocent.
Yes, in 1954.
And the thing that I think is interesting about it is that comics, the sort of comics, the various publishers and everyone ended up self-censoring because of it, is what happened, because
Yes.
it wasn't a legal thing, correct?
Well, it was not a legal thing, but it was as a result of legal pressure. And it was an example of an industry just not being able to take the pressure anymore because they thought what was coming was worse. The precedent for that was in the film industry when the production code was adopted in Hollywood, and that was done because there was threat of state by state censorship of movies. And in fact, at the time, it was constitutional for states each have their own censorship boards for whether or not movies could be distributed in their communities. And so Hollywood's reaction was to self-regulate, and they adopted the production code, which imposed very strict regulations. And the comic code that came out of the Senate hearings in the 50s was really a replication of what had happened with film. And the upshot was that the number of titles for comic books for the first time in a decade started to decline. Hundreds, if not thousands, of artists and writers were fired. They lost their jobs. And comics became very bland for about 10 or 15 years when things started changing with underground comics. And
You mentioned Zap in your
Yes.
in your book, which I think it's funny because Crumb sort of with Zap and all of his work was the underground was very subversive then, and
Yes.
Crumb's arc went from subversive to being, the artist, the Bears or the Grateful Dead, to being a major. They have a documentary about Crumb, and then now he's subversive again because he's been sort of canceled out by culture again because his art is sort of has upset the current censors, I guess.
Yeah, there's always going to be something that upsets somebody.
Yes.